Welcome back. This is part 3 of our video lecture series on compare contrast. And if you're paying close attention, you can see that this slide has changed a little bit in the last few minutes. While I was uploading the last video, I went through and made some changes, including rearranging the order in the PowerPoint to show, reflect what we talked about, or the order we talked about these things in. I do that periodically with a lot of the PowerPoints. Normally I just re-record instead of demonstrating that the changes happened, but I decided to go ahead and leave the changes in this time to kind of reinforce the idea of editing and proofreading. Even I, as a teacher, don't get things right the first time, or the second, or the third normally, and I have to go back and I have to make changes in between, one semester and the next, or even in between, when I write it and when I record it, and I realize when I'm recording it, maybe I want to do something a little different. And the same process takes place as you're writing. You do want to go back and you kind of look at things and make sure it's going to work in the best way that you're envisioning it, or the best way that you can make it work right then. So I thought that was a good way to kind of demonstrate to you that I walk the walk. I don't just tell you to do something that I'm not doing myself. Okay, so now we're going to do an example paragraph on how to write a compare-contrast paragraph. And I'm going to take you through each of the steps. So first we start with our prompt. And in this prompt, compare and contrast two places that you've lived or would like to live. What's something they have in common? What are some important differences? Where would you prefer to live? And if you look closely at this prompt, you can see that it's asking for the things that you need to write a compare-contrast. It comes out and says compare and contrast two places that you lived, but it also says, you need to have a similarity. And then what are some important differences? Where would you prefer to live tells you that this more than likely would be best suited as an evaluative paragraph. And that my transition sentence is probably going to relate to this. So I've looked at that, and now I want to do some quick comparisons between Jacksonville and Gadsden with just a quick list. They're both cities in Alabama that are relatively populated. Gadsden's more urban. I have more friends in Jacksonville. The cost of living is lower in Jacksonville, but there's more to do in Gadsden. And Gadsden has lakes and some prettier areas. Jacksonville also has some really pretty areas though too. So now let's go ahead and make my topic sentence. So I'm taking basically a similar approach that we've used in previous PowerPoints, and the step-by-step evaluative one that we used earlier in this PowerPoint. And I can go back and show that to you to remind you, because it's been a few minutes. It's going to be a little further up here. Okay, so here was the evaluative one. So we're going to start by reversing the prompt. Both Gadsden and Jacksonville are small cities in Alabama. Add an evaluative statement, but I prefer Jacksonville because, and then put in my evidence. And you'll see that I did this basically the same thing here. Both Jacksonville and Gadsden are cities in East Alabama. I reversed the prompt. I prefer Jacksonville because that's the evaluative statement of the lower cost of living, the sense of community I feel there, and the small town feel. Those are the three pieces of evidence that I'm going to use in my paragraph. And it fits that model that we talked about earlier. And I've decided to use a point-by-point structure. So we've got my topic sentence. Now we want to work on the exposition. So I'm going to start with point 1. I'm going to start by introducing it. Jacksonville has a lower cost of living than Gadsden. Then I'm going to go ahead and present my evidence, or my first piece of evidence for point 1. Many apartments in Jacksonville are available for under $600 a month because the complexes have to compete with college housing. In Gadsden, apartments in a safe neighborhood start closer to $800 a month. So we're comparing the cost of living, which is point 1, for Jacksonville and Gadsden side by side. So we're going to continue that with a little bit more information. I work in Jacksonville, so living there reduces my daily commute greatly. If I lived in Gadsden, I would need to plan to drive 45 minutes each way, which means that I would have to pay more in gas, car insurance, and wear and tear on my car. So there we have another point related to cost of living, and I've done Jacksonville, then Gadsden. And then I want to go ahead and analyze that. Why is it important? So the lower rent and transportation cost makes Jacksonville a better choice for my budget. So my next point was sense of community. So like I did before, I'm going to start by introducing it. I also feel a greater sense of community in Jacksonville compared with Gadsden. And then I'm going to present my evidence. I graduated from JSU and I still have a lot of friends there. In Gadsden, I know very few people and would less likely feel invested in the community. Because I work in Jacksonville, many of my coworkers and students live there as well. That makes it easier for me to meet with colleagues at a bar, hang out after work, or meet with students than it would be in Gadsden. And then I'm going to analyze it. I'm going to explain why it's important. The sense of community makes Jacksonville a place that I would be more likely to call home than Gadsden. I'm going to do the same thing with the third point, which is small town. So I'm going to introduce it. Although there is more to do in Gadsden, I prefer the small town feel of Jacksonville. Now I'm going to compare Jacksonville small town versus more urban feel side by side. I grew up in a rural neighborhood and I find the hustle and bustle of even small cities overwhelming. While some people might enjoy the wealth of activities and shopping options in Gadsden, I likely wouldn't take advantage of those. I'd be more likely to read a book or paint on a Friday night than go to a bar. And then talk about why it's important. As such, I'd feel more at home in a smaller town like Jackson than in the more urban Gadsden. And then we're going to write our transition sentence. So our transition sentence is going to take what we've discussed and kind of sum it up and why it's important. And the best way to do this is kind of to paraphrase your thesis and explain why. So as a result of the low cost of living, small town feel, and sense of community, I feel like I could more easily establish a home and family in Jacksonville than Gadsden. So you can see I've summarized my main points, and then I've talked about why that's important in my transition sentence. Excuse me. So now we're going to talk about finishing up a compare-contrast paragraph, because they do sometimes require a little bit more in the finishing steps than the ones we've talked about thus far, because we're dealing with more information, right? So evaluating and revising. So the first thing we want to do is ask ourselves some questions just to make sure that everything is working the way it should be. Is my paragraph focused on one similarity and a few differences, or vice versa, or am I trying to cover too much? Have I chosen things with a good basis of comparison or good grounds for comparison? Am I introducing my ideas in a logical way? Are my comparisons or contrasts clear throughout the paragraph? So does the reader know when I'm talking about object A versus object B? Is the comparison and contrast between the two clear? And do all of my comparisons and contrasts relate back to my thesis or topic sentence? In editing with compare and contrast paragraphs, you often want to add transition words, as we saw in those first two examples. These help the reader to understand the relationship between the items being compared. So if you want to talk about how two things are the same, you might want to use words like same, similar, similarly, in the same way, the same as, both, like, in common, as well, and also. If you want to emphasize that the two things are differ, you can use words like differ, different, difference, however, but, like, although, even though, on the other hand, and while. These words help to show the reader what they're supposed to take away from the sentence that they're about to read. So if I said, Gadsden has a lot of pretty scenery, it's not quite clear how that relates to Jacksonville. But if I said, like Jacksonville, Gadsden has a lot of pretty scenery, then it's much clearer how the two things go together. So it's good to go back when you're right before you proofread, and just add in words like this if you don't have them in there already, just to make things a little clearer for the reader. And then finally, please proofread. Read aloud. You'll catch most of the typos that way, and make sure you check for grammar, punctuation, spelling, things like sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, making sure that you're correctly indicating plural nouns versus possessive nouns, things like that. Make sure you go in and do that before you turn it in, because as the semester goes on, I do take off more points for those things. And that takes us to the end of our compare and contrast lectures. So I look forward to reading your paragraphs, and I hope you guys have a great day.